Hey, everybody. Welcome to the initial podcast of Andy on Immigration. I'm your host for these podcasts. My name is Andy. And quick, before we get into the content of today's episode, which is all talking about Immigration 101, and it's based on U.S. immigration, just a quick intro to Andy on Immigration itself. You can find out more about us at our website www.andyonimmigration.com. And you can also look for us on LinkedIn at our business page by the same name, Andy on Immigration. Generally, Andy on Immigration is in its podcast form, is designed to provide content that's explainers, but also content that might be a little bit deeper on immigration issues, more from a little bit broader view. So we won't be talking about daily issues of how many people were deported today or those kind of things, but more of a general topical coverage. And our core business portion is really more directed at immigration professionals, HR persons, persons in immigration policy, those people who are really deep into immigration on a daily basis. So that's part of our core. And in our podcast, we might tend to go a little bit more general on things like today's session, which I guess you could say is rated G for general audiences, because this is meant to be an introduction to U.S. immigration, and hence the name U.S. Immigration 101. And because it's still a fairly big topic, we're going to break this down into three separate episodes, part one, a part two, and a part three. The first part will be focused more on general immigration parlance and the setup of U.S. immigration law, and also talk a little bit about citizenship. Then we'll get into more of the legal categories for immigration, the permanent residence and temporary visa categories. And thirdly, we'll get into, in our third part three session, will be more about the more problematic parts of immigration, as it were. That's the undocumented population and how that's affecting us and what's kind of going on in there. Just a little explainer on about all those things that are very basic now. So this session today, parts 1, 2, and 3, Immigration 101, will be more for a general audience if you have an interest in immigration. It might be for some people and professionals and things like that, just to get a little bit of refresher course or a little reminder of where they sit in the universe. And throughout this session and the next three sessions in part 1 of 3, I will be using my producer for the show, Rich, as I say, the average Joe, or in this case, the average Rich, to kind of be our tester to make sure that I'm staying on point and that the things are explanatory to somebody who, Rich he has a little bit of knowledge about immigration. He's been across it in a few different circumstances, but I'm going to use him kind of just to check me and to ask any questions or things that were explained that needed to be explained. And I'll grade Rich in Immigration 101 at the end as well. But in any event, here we go with Immigration 101, Part 1. And again, this session is more about the overall system, categories, and U.S. citizens. So more specifically in this session, we will deal with the part one, again, of this session is the goals, basic concepts, and definitions. We're going to give you a breakdown of the U.S. overall U.S. population. That's all 345 million people inside the U.S. And we're going to break them down by category to tell you how they are present legally here in the United States or not legally present in the U.S. And that first day today, or the first session, will cover citizens. In part two of our three sessions, we will cover permanent legal aliens, what people more commonly know as the green card holders, even though the cards that they have for permanent residence haven't been green in probably 40 or 50 years. And then we also talk about temporary legal aliens. Again, so these people have a status, they're lawfully here in the United States. And then in part three, we'll get to the probably more political part of it at current in 2025. And we'll talk about undocumented, unlawful, and illegal aliens, as it were. And at the end, we'll give a summary with an Immigration 101 report card, both for the U.S. government and how it's performing and the status of immigration. And also, we'll judge Rich on how he did with his questions and answers and such. In any event, let's move on to the next slide and the next bit of material. So, broad look at the goals of U.S. immigration law. Now, there have been immigration laws, as you may have seen, that have gone back to pretty much the origins of the country in 1790 and beyond that talk about citizenship and other things. One of the things that we're going to talk about during our sessions is defining and determining citizenship, how someone becomes a U.S. citizen, and how many of them there are. We're going to talk about national security and border integrity a little bit, but that is a defining goal of U.S. immigration law. So we hear a lot about that lately, about border walls and all that sort of stuff. That's always been a theme of U.S. immigration law and a goal. Another item that we cover is limiting foreign influence. That usually you'll see that in terms of how we limit the numbers of people coming in various categories from various countries, so that there's no one single influx of people coming in at one time from one country that sort of upsets our balance. Another of the goals of U.S. immigration is family unity. So there's family categories with immediate relatives, which are spouses, parents, and children of U.S. citizens being sort of a favored category, but there are a few other family categories as well that are involved. And again, those categories exist in large part to promote family unity. We will talk about, in the context of the goals of U.S. immigration law, securing needed labor and highly skilled workers. So we're going to talk about a couple temporary visa categories and what those sort of occupations are. Another function of U.S. immigration law is to protect U.S. worker jobs. So in some circumstances, the Department of Labor, you will see them involved in certain processes, and they basically exist there to protect the U.S. workers from a foreign national person coming in and taking a U.S. person's job, in essence. Now, other goals of U.S. immigration law are humanitarian. So there are certain categories like asylees and refugees that promote that, and we'll talk about various of those categories. And another goal of U.S. immigration law for quite a long time has been to exclude those deemed undesirable. And we'll talk about some of those rules. Now, primarily the number one category today that you'll find for undesirable is usually somebody with a criminal background, and that might make them inadmissible to the United States. But we'll go back and take a look at when some of those laws came into play and how they affected the overall flow of U.S. immigration. Now, basic classifications of U.S. immigration law. In the big picture, when you take everybody anywhere on the planet, all humans, U.S. immigration law looks at everybody in two different primary categories: citizens and aliens, with basically everybody else who isn't a citizen. In the citizen group, you will find people who become citizens by birth in the United States, and that's via the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Some citizens become citizens by virtue of being born abroad as a child of a U.S. citizen. And that's usually under certain circumstances or certain conditions, typically which is the one or both of the U.S. parents must have resided physically in the U.S. for a period before the child's birth. And the third way people become citizens is by a process called naturalization, which is an application that's generally made at 5 years after somebody has achieved permanent resident status, or basically, in other words, acquired the green card. Now, we talked a little bit about the citizen groups. Now let's look at some of the various alien groups. Aliens inside the U.S. can be defined as permanent resident aliens. Again, those persons are authorized to live and work in the United States indefinitely, and basically for the remainder of their lives. Again, the acronym for that status is generally, we call them green card holders loosely. Again, the green card, I think it was in the 1970s or so, was the last time they were actually green, but they started making them in various colors, more tan, and now I don't even know what color you consider them now because they're all glossy and embedded with certain security features. But the originals, at least back in the 1970s, were actually green. In any event, although they were called permanent resident aliens, as we've seen recently in the news, it is possible, because they're still aliens, for their status, for them to lose their permanent resident status. Again, the most common reason for that would be some sort of criminal activity. And that, again, just a reminder that even though they're called permanent resident aliens, there are certain circumstances where their status may not be permanent. Non-immigrant aliens. Those are persons in the US temporarily, which means for a finite period. It could be 6 months, a year, 3 years, 5 years. And they're here subject to certain conditions defined by the non-immigrant category. So if you're somebody here as a visitor going to Disney World, you might be here in a B status or a B2 status. If you are somebody here working as an IT professional for a US employer, you might be in H1B status. And we'll talk a little bit more about those various types of statuses when we go along. Again, you're here for a specific purpose. In the case of the H1B worker, they're here to work for typically for a specific employer for a certain period of time, maybe up to 3 years. So it's time limited, it's purpose limited, but they are lawfully here present in the US as non-immigrants. Another broad group is humanitarian aliens. I might be using a little broader definition of this term than you might see elsewhere, but basically, it's anyone who's admitted under special circumstances, for example, to process an asylum claim in something called temporary protected status or TPS, which is a status that's granted by the executive branch when there are adverse countries and adverse conditions in someone's home country. So, for example, we've seen this recently kind of in the news. You've kind of gotten this flavors for some of these folks. They might be from Haiti and they were granted temporary protected status because of civil unrest in the country. They might be from Honduras or El Salvador, which is places that have had this status in the past, perhaps because of an earthquake or another natural disaster, a hurricane, something that caused that country to be put in an adverse position and certain individuals to be at risk. So, as a humanitarian measure, temporary protected status is granted for them to live and oftentimes get employment authorization and be in the U.S. temporarily. Now, the fourth category of aliens inside the U.S. are what are known as illegal or undocumented aliens. They're persons present in the United States without authorization, i.e., they're out of status. I will most commonly use either undocumented or unauthorized alien. There's a little bit of to do about whether or not calling somebody illegal alien is a proper term and such. There are those in immigration world, mostly in the more immigrant category, who would say that illegal is the proper term. It's kind of the proper term by statute and by definition. But in any event, we'll commonly use undocumented aliens or unauthorized alien. Just because it's so well known, I may also use illegal occasionally. So those are all the aliens inside the US. And again, anybody who's outside of the US and not a citizen is basically the rest of the world. So that's a little introduction to the broad structure, sort of those goals of US immigration law that we talked about. And also, we talked a little bit about what citizenship is, what an alien is, that big picture division between those two, how people become citizens by the three different means, and what all the aliens are and what their statuses are inside the United States. And with that, I'm going to bring on our currently a student, Rich, and just say, Rich, you've had a few minutes. Hopefully, I didn't put you to sleep there. Maybe had a couple sips of your coffee while you were going along here, and thinking, was there anything in that first few slides that really struck you as odd, or that you had a question about, or those sorts of things?
Nothing specific. Certainly didn't think about the specifics of the categories that I kind of probably had a few of those categories kind of in my mind just combined. So no, I think you kind of broke down just a little bit differently the way that I just to understand the groups a little bit differently.
Yeah. I mean, like last year in the presidential election, we had that to do with the Haitians that were in um, Springfield, Ohio, and allegedly were making googly eyes at the neighbor's cats for dinner or something like that. Do you remember? Let me now, as I researched it, a lot of those Haitians were here in either a temporary protected status or they were given sort of a humanitarian parole status to be in the U.S. So they're here lawfully. They oftentimes, by virtue of that status, such as TPS or temporary protected status, could obtain employment authorization. Does that, when those stories came up, was that kind of news to you, or did that sort of make sense, or did you kind of understand it
To,
now that you see it in this context?
to be honest, I wasn't sure. I assumed that it was a mixture of all of those, that some of them were citizens that who had obtained U.S. citizenship at some point, maybe have been here since before some of the things that have happened in the last 5 to 10 years. And then, like any, you know, little Italies that people have in their hometowns. Like
Right.
back in the day, like some of those neighborhoods were people that had I migrated from Italy and had become citizens, and now their brother has moved from Sicily or whatever it might be. So I just always assumed that there was a combination of people that were refugees because of political and or weather related events that have
Right.
happened, and
Right.
then some were citizens. So yeah, so I
Yep.
kind of like didn't think about it so much as that the temporary visa type thing. I guess I kind of didn't know the extent of that as much as I thought I did.
Okay. Good. Good. So it seemed like you're playing along well. So we're going to go
Yep.
on to the next category and the next parts of the slides and work through that. So, by the numbers, there are some 345 million persons resident in the US at present. That's a rough estimate. And all these numbers here are estimates as well. And it's not there, if you added all these up, they may not come exactly to 345 million because even that's an estimate. And a lot of these categories either don't have very good statistics on them or it's sort of a moving target. So they might be measured at different times or different dates. So altogether, realize that these numbers are not exact, but they're a decent approximation for the 345 million or so persons in the US right now. Probably the biggest unknown category, all this is the one at the bottom, the unauthorized aliens in the US. I used a figure of 11 million, which I think I got from the Pew Research Group. Again, that's a broad estimate. I mean, they're unauthorized, they're undocumented, and they're kind of in the shadows. So, not surprisingly, they're hard to measure. Um, but in any event, you look at the various categories. Most of the people here, by and large, are citizens, and the permanent resident group's pretty big at 13 million. And there you have a mix of the other categories that we sort of talked about: those legal aliens, temporary ones that are lawfully here, humanitarian aliens who also are lawfully here, around 3 million, and 11 million in the unauthorized category. So let's do a little bit of a breakdown on this. Again, the total out on the far left of my slide, if you're able to see this presentation, are the US citizens. If you go into the group that were foreign born, which includes some US citizens who may have been typically those by naturalization, so they weren't citizens at birth, um, that group is about 51.6 million, or over about 15.6% of the total US population is foreign born. And historically, over the past 150 years or so, that's a pretty big number. It approached over 14% in the early 1900s. Then we had some cutbacks in immigration in the 1920s, and that lasted until the 1960s. But ever since then, the numbers have been creeping back up. And this is the high point from the statistics that I've seen over the past 100 or 150 years in terms of the percentage of foreign born persons in the US. So, just a interesting little side note there. Um, the temporary residents in this, out of the 345 million, I estimate to be about 17 million. So, they don't have a permanent status. And again, they're either likely to leave or they're likely to stay and move up this kind of ladder into the permanent resident status and beyond, into the citizen status at some point. But that's about 17 million measured in the country right now. And again, since the term alien covers everybody on the planet, there's another 7.6 billion or so persons who are aliens not inside the US, according to the US immigration system. So, a little history on how we got here. And this is a pictorial representation of persons obtaining lawful permanent resident status from 1820 to 2023. So I had to dig into a Department of Homeland site, and they have some of these numbers there, and I put it into a little Excel chart. And this is the way it looks when you create that chart. And it gives you a little bit idea about the flow of people into the US to obtain permanent resident status. And you'll see that there's some ebbs and flows. I go back to sort of what I call 1875 law, but there was actually a series of laws. Initially, they were in the 1870s were focused on persons of Chinese and Asian descent. Um, they were purportedly trying to keep out some people who may have had criminal type intentions or other things, but those laws went in 1875. And then over time, over about the next 10 or 15 years into the early 1990s, there were other laws that sort of kept out what was, the groups that were deemed undesirables. Again, that's the criminals, the people with communicable diseases, or certain other people that were not deemed to be desirable. And so those laws kind of came in, and that probably led to that little dip that you see on my chart from 1875 until 1880 or so. But there was such a flow, some 20 million plus immigrants in what I'll call the Ellis Island days. So in your heads, please picture the wobbly black and white videos of the people streaming in past the Statue of Liberty and onto Ellis Island. Those were the 20 million plus primarily European immigrants who came between 1880 and 1920. So that's the big bump there. And you were getting into numbers of 1.2 million permanent residents per year in the early 1900s up until 1920. In the 1920s, we started seeing some laws that pulled back. But even before that, in 1918, we had World War I going on. So that's where you see a dip there in the late teens, the 19 teens, so to speak, in 1908 through 1918 when we had World War One. Then we had our 20th century pandemic, the Spanish flu, which came in around 1918 to 1920. And again, those numbers went down drastically at that point. And also, we started seeing laws that changed and kind of limited the flow of immigration into the U.S., primarily to northern or northwest European and countries in Canada. And that was that 1924 law where it put in pretty big limits on people coming from most countries. And therefore, from that all the way through until the 1950s, immigration kind of was on the was very low into the U.S. In the 50s, after World War II, it started coming back up, and then we had a 1965 law which broadened the categories and at least started probably a phase of more immigration coming from other parts of the globe, particularly Asia. Latin America had already started before that, but that was a big. That 1965 law was kind of a broadener. There was another law earlier in 1952, which kind of set most of the immigration provisions we know of today, or at least a lot of the structure that we know today. But it was there, the 1965 law, where you started seeing more and more people come up and gain permanent residence in the U.S. In the 1980s, there was a special little provision from uh, Ronald Reagan and the Republicans in Congress, and all of Congress, which proposed a new law that basically did two things. Number one, it said if you had been here in the U.S. illegally before a certain date, you could apply for permanent resident status. And number two, it put in a requirement on employers to complete a document of employment verification that we call the I-9 document. That was the IRCA law of 1986 that created that obligation on employers. And the thought was is that, well, okay, we're going to clean up all the currently illegal persons illegally present in the U.S., give them a chance to come clean one time, and then after that, we're going to use what we think is the main carrot for them coming here, which is employment, better pay, and all that sort of thing. And we're going to limit that going forward. Well, you can see that it contributed to a major spike in the number of permanent residents coming to the United States that were granted applications that were granted in the late 1980s. But it didn't prevent the flow of the undocumented. And that population continued to flow. And probably by 2000, the year 2000 or so, the early 2000s, we were back up to some perhaps 10 million, estimates of 10 million people illegally present in the United States. So more recently, we said sort of more an even level flow of about a million to 1.2 million permanent residents. every year, kind of in the 2000s. So that's been a fairly consistent number ever since that time. But that just gives you an idea, kind of where we've been and where we're kind of headed as a country in terms of the numbers of immigrants we're accepting. Now, citizenship, birthright citizenship. Again, if you all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. That is the exact language of the 14th Amendment. Now, under the the first Trump administration, um, there were some looking into the 14th Amendment and whether or not birthright citizenship should be at least as broad as it was. And again, those are some of those headlines that you see posted. Those are actually ones from 2018, 2017, where they were looking at that issue. And once again, they're looking at that issue again and they're litigating it in the courts. But as of right now, birth in the U.S. is sort of an absolute. Whether you're born to persons who are undocumented or persons temporarily in the U.S., as long as you're born here, you're considered a citizen, and that's the current status of the interpretation of that 14th Amendment. Now, there are some categories, as you see there at the bottom in the NBC News and LA Times article about some Chinese immigrants and some Russians who were sending, the women were coming in when they were, say, a little before 6 months pregnant, or around that time, and then staying so that they could give birth to a U.S. citizen child. They call that birther tourism in some places. And there was also some schemes where travel agents were helping the pregnant Chinese women coming in to give birth to a child here. So, because again, under the 14th Amendment, they were given U.S. citizenship. But broadly speaking, that's still the rule. Unless somebody does it, kind of fraudulently in one of those ways. If you're born here, you're a citizen. So that's the end of my part one. And before we depart on part one, I'm just going to call back Rich. And Rich, we had a few slides there about citizenship and things like that. Was there anything at the end of part one that was at all interesting to you, surprising to you, or wasn't clear that we can help clarify before we close the
You might,
book on part one?
yeah, you mentioned a law that went through. What was the law that you mentioned that was more recent? What was the name of that law?
There was. Are you talking about the 1986 law?
Yeah, what was that?
Yeah,
You
there was
said that.
the Immigration Reform and Control Act, or IRCA, was the one that
Okay,
put in place the
I had never
employer
heard of. I had
placement
never
requirements.
never heard
And
that before. I never
the
heard
other
that term before.
right, and then the process for those people who were here illegally to obtain permanent resident status, there was called legalization, was often the most common term that was given to that, and there were thousands of them, primarily Central Americans,
I certainly
who took advantage of
remember
that.
that kind of come out of the shadows time frame, but I just
Right.
didn't realize there was a. I didn't realize the terminology that you kind of brought up. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yep. Good.
Interesting. Yeah.
Okay. A good
Well,
question.
I mean, the numbers. What was great about the second part was the numbers. Like, I don't think I had any sense of what the numbers were
Hmm.
in terms of how many citizens are naturalized versus green cards. I don't think I had a sense of they because politically there's a lot of numbers that get thrown around and there's 14 billion people in the country illegally and stuff like that. So
Yeah, and it kind of seems like to me, I found it interesting when I looked up that foreign-born percentage, the number of foreign-born persons was up over 15%, because it seems like I think that was the same thing that was going on around 1920, and
right.
then as all of a sudden around 2020, we're back in that same, we've been around 14% for a number of years, but it seemed like in the past 5 to 10 years, it kind of cracked above that 15%. And I don't know if there's any, statistical logic to this, but it seems to me that that's kind of when the system starts kicking back against, against immigration even more so is when that foreign-born population gets above 15%, hitting that 14 above 15% for sure. So
Yeah.
there seems to be a little bit more blowback. But anyways, that's the status of things. Thanks, Rich, for your help. And I just want to make a note before we leave part one, that if you don't go on to part two of the course, You can find out more at our website again, www.andyonimmigration.com. Or you can email me if you have any questions or comments about part one to andy@andyonimmigration.com, or follow me on my Andy on Immigration at our LinkedIn page as well. So again, thank you everybody for sitting through session one. We will be having part two again, which goes on to talk about how people become permanent residents a little bit, and all those people who are legally present but not citizens in the U.S. So without further ado, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time at part two.